Well, hey there. This is Melissa, and I am a real estate broker, coach, and educator. And today, y'all, today is going to be a great episode. Today, I am joined by John G. George Jr., if I can get it all right. John George. Thanks for being here with me today. Um, Y'all, John is on broker lawyer committee with me, and I will tell you, he is an attorney, a consultant, a speaker, a businessman, and I believe, are you born and raised in Texas, John?
I was born in Virginia, but raised in Texas.
Got here as soon as you could. I love
Exactly.
that. I love that. But for about 16 years or so, right? It says John has been a trusted advisor for prominent real estate industry professionals and principals who seek out his unique ability to advise on both legal and practical considerations, which is one of the things I think you do a fantastic job of, by the way. And then sitting on broker lawyer committee, this is your second round. And
It
you're the
is.
co-chair
Mhm.
this year, right?
Exactly.
Okay. And we won't bring up the alumni because, well, we saw that football game over the weekend, so I'm sure we
I stay out of that. I just like politics. I don't try to get into the divisive thing, especially on the front end.
yeah, no college football discussion here on the podcast today. But sir, thank you so much for joining me. I really do appreciate it. And I think what people are going to want to talk about is Trek and the contracts and the fact that, well, we've had a lot of contracts changes in the year 2024, haven't we?
There's been a lot of changes all around. Trek, Texas realtors, the industry. It's a year of change and hopefully advancement when we look back on it in the future. But it definitely has been an interesting year to say the least.
I love that. A year of advancement. That's actually the right attitude we should all be having, but most of us are a little bit more grumpy that it's had so much change and change again. And here we are changing one more time. But I feel like this time, with the change coming from Trek, there were some really good positive things that I think came out of the change that we're making to this contract, which we're going to start diving into here in a second. But I also think, they talk about it sometimes, and you can kind of, throw in your 2 cents on this. But the fact that Trek moves slow, right? That government entities move slower and that we are, regulated heavily. And so we must move slower. And it was nice to have that hindsight, so to speak, of watching what Texas Realtors went through with the contracts changes and the forms changes that they put out, and then having some of that to be able to say, let's use what we've learned before we create something that everybody's got to use. Do you feel like that
Yeah,
was a benefit?
it's a blessing and a curse in different ways. And we can see with the number of changes that came out on the Texas Realtor side and how quickly they had to move.
Mhm.
At Trek, which maybe we start with the distinguishing Texas Realtors versus Trek. I get a lot of confusion on, well, it's the Trek form when it's really a Texas Realtors form.
Mhm.
And so, starting there, maybe the Texas Realtors being the trade association that is the largest one that represents license holders here in Texas. That if you're a member of NAR and Texas Realtors, then you can call yourself a realtor.
Right.
But they can develop their own forms. Where Trek, being the governmental side, it's that long process you were describing. It's by law we can't just make changes very quickly like Texas Realtors can the very next day or within a week or however long it takes them internally. Trek takes many months, unless it's a true emergency, to develop any forms, which gave us on the broker lawyer committee and on the commission the benefit of seeing what's happening in the industry, of thinking through it, the forms and what needs to be changed a little bit more. And there's, as you know, some very exciting meetings we had, at least exciting to us that geek out on these things. But
Us
we had a
contract
lot of meetings and a
nerds.
lot of thought process time
Yeah.
that went into these, and so those many months, I think, produced some really good changes that we'll go through today that not only are related to the big compensation issues, but many other things that have been in the works for quite a while.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that you said, here's the difference between the two, because you're right. It comes up a lot and people may not understand, Trek only has a handful of forms comparatively, comparatively speaking, when you're looking at what they get as a member benefit of being a member of Texas Realtors, they get hundreds of forms, like 200 and something forms that we just don't have available from the Real Estate Commission. And I think that it's a big deal for people to understand that that's a huge member benefit for those who are a member. But not everybody in the state is a member, right? We've got commercial practitioners and, folks that do farm and ranch maybe aren't members, or people that might do property management may or may not be members. And Trek has to worry about all of the folks that have a real estate license, whether they're a member or not. And I think it's important for people to get that for sure.
It is, and it's a huge benefit there in the number. Now, if Trek has a form that's for mandatory use, another trade association like Texas Realtors or cannot develop a form that's any different, right? So they have to use the same form as Trek. But Trek drafts them to be balanced for both sides and are available for anybody to use. The public and attorneys can get on there. Anybody can get on the Trek's website to download those forms. Where as a member of Texas Realtors, you have many forms that go beyond the limited scope of Texas Realtors forms that help buyers or sellers or agents and brokers directly. That I don't think a lot realize those can only be used if you're a member of those organizations. And by having that benefit, it really gives the practitioner or the agents the ability to tailor the contracts, their practice a lot better than if they just had the base forms. So that is something not to overlook. I think so many of us there are realtors that have access to the forms. We get kind of complacent in thinking that this is always there. And that's not the case. And
Not true.
the forms, and we'll get into the differences between some of them. But and I forget the number. Do you recall the exact number that Texas Realtors has available in terms of?
It's like 200.
I think it's in the.
Yeah, it's 200 and something forms, and I think Trek's at like 42, something like that.
That sounds right. It's something I should know off the top of my head, but
Yeah.
but it's a it's a relatively limited number, and they're consumer oriented. Where Texas Realtors not only has those that are consumer facing type forms, but also those for broker management and for the broker buyer seller relationship.
Yeah.
Where of course many of our Trek forms don't really dive into that broker client relationship.
Yeah, that's usually how I explain it to people. I say, look, if it's getting signed by a buyer and a seller, probably a Trek form, or certainly if it's a Trek form, it's probably, maybe it's the other way around. If it's a Trek form, it's probably signed by the buyer and the seller. But if it is signed by the agent on behalf of the brokerage and the consumer, like a buyer rep agreement or a listing agreement, those are not coming from Trek, because Trek is so much more balanced, like you said, between the buyer and the seller, as opposed to working for the brokerage, for the agent, for the real estate practitioner to have that document between them and their consumer. That definitely is a member benefit for sure.
It is, and those are, you can tailor your business. I think we often lose sight of the fact that we are in business as either an agent or a broker. In those forms are tools for our business as brokers and agents. Where if you look at Trek side, we're there to protect consumers. We're there to facilitate transactions, to minimize controversy, to really hone in on the transaction itself, not the business of brokerage at the end of the day.
Yeah. Well, so let's talk about this big change, because I feel like we change forms sometimes, right? In the real estate space as far as Trek is concerned. But I think it's important for anybody listening to understand, we don't just willy-nilly change them, right? It's fewer and farther between. But I think it's also important to understand that when we make a change to like the 1 to 4 family contract, it's kind of like the mothership, right? When something changes there, it sort of trickles down to the other places that might likely either be affected, right? If we change a paragraph number, it maybe affects another form. But also that it might start with that 1 to 4 family contract and then trickle down into the unimproved property contract or something like that, right? Because it sort of starts at that nucleus at the beginning. So when we make a change to the 1 to 4 family, it's kind of a big deal all the way around, right? I mean, is that kind of the way you would explain that to somebody?
I think so. I mean, you can always look at it as the base. The paragraph numbers between the contracts generally match up. So if we make a change to one, it's generally going to be the same paragraph in the others, unless there's a specific reason for that particular type of contract, like the farm and ranch. If there's a farm and ranch issue that needs to be added on, or a new home issue, or a vacant land issue. So you see some changes for particular provisions, but generally the paragraphs all match up. And I think in my brain as well, it starts with a 1 to 4, and
Mhm.
then we look at modifying it as necessary. But generally if a change is made in 1 to 4, it's made to the others as well.
Yeah, agreed. All right. Well, so knowing that, let's talk about some changes that are coming up for that Trek 1 to 4 family contract, because that's a really big deal for folks right now to understand that things are happening. And there were some changes that I would say are more minor, and then there were some changes that were way more, structurally different that I think that the consumers need to be aware of, as well as the, real estate agents that might be, listening today. Um, and I don't want to start with compensation, although that's bigger. I don't know. Maybe you do want to start with compensation. That was a big piece of what we changed was paragraph 12, but we had a lot of other little things along the way to get us there. So I don't know, maybe we should start with that one because that seems to be the biggest fact that we've made a change. And I feel like that's probably a place where people might have some questions or concerns because we used to use paragraph 12A1B for a specific reason for a long, 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 long time. And now that's kind of shifting a little bit. So maybe we should start there. What do you
Yeah,
think?
I think that's not a bad idea.
Okay.
And just let everybody know in advance, there are some really good changes here that, some of it, look at real legally or real, a lot of legalese, but there's some real good practical changes as well. That's going to make life easier for buyers and sellers and agents and brokers as well. So we'll get into some of the more fun stuff as we come along. But I think knocking out the big one, which can be, I think, kept pretty simple. I think the more simple we look at this and keep a kind of almost a narrow focus, it will help it be more understood.
I
And
agree.
a lot of the questions that I've been seeing out there and getting, I think is tied into other forms and looking at outside the box of what's in the actual contract. Of course, we can't look at in isolation with the other forms being used out there, but um, I think it's ultimately a really good change, and maybe it'd be helpful for the listeners as well to understand how these contracts are made and what goes into it from the broker lawyer committee to start. That we both serve on it, and the makeup of the committee is really the magic behind these contracts, being lawyers and brokers together, 6 lawyers, 6 brokers, and then one public member that come together, and then we meet generally in Austin, unless it's by Zoom, and hammer out these changes. And you have, if it's up to the lawyers, and just making a joke here, but these contracts be 100 pages long, right, and have all this legal language in there, and the brokers come in and say that's crazy, we won't understand that, let's keep it simple, and goes back and forth in a really good dialogue at these meetings to come up with these changes. And it was amazing starting here with the compensation section in paragraph 12 on, I think, how both the brokers and lawyers went back and forth to ultimately end up with the language we did. But not only as a committee, but us individually as well. I know had shifting mindsets even in the meetings that we had
Yeah.
to come up with it. But I feel that's understanding that we look at it from multiple perspectives gives you an idea that this wasn't just thrown in there. A lot of these thoughts and concerns that were raised were thoroughly talked through,
thousand
which
percent. And
I think really great.
yeah, and I think you make a good point. A lot of people don't know how many hours this particular change took, right? But I think that that's true every time there's a change, right? Is that it's not that Trek doesn't listen. I think we listen and we listen well. I think that people had the opportunity to watch the live Zoom, whatever of the meeting. It's maybe not a Zoom exactly, maybe it's a Teams, but watch the live meeting happen in progress electronically. And then obviously people were welcome to come and be guests because we had guests, but then they can go back and watch the recording of it later if that time didn't work for them. And so they could go and see really all the work that was put in. But then I think there were a lot more public comments this time for all the things that were happening. And to go back and watch the replay again, and you as the co-chair did a great job of saying, hey, everybody, we got like 85 comments on this one thing, and they all said the same thing. So thanks to all 85 of you for mentioning this. Here's what the comment was. And then we would talk about what that thing was, which I think was, I hope, my hope is that it helps the agents know that we're listening to what their concerns are and how it actually impacts them in the field. As we are really trying to look out for the best interest of the consumer, but without foregoing completely the rest of the pieces of the puzzle, right? There's just a lot of people with interest in this particular document. So
And we read every comment from every person that sends one in, whether it's a broker or an agent, the public. If any comments that are sent to our committee in response to the proposed forms that are out there, we read every single one. And
yeah.
our packets are several hundred pages thick. When we have so many, like we did for the compensation, we summarize it in advance. But we really do consider everything. And this last time we had, I think, 11 hours of formal meeting time
Yeah.
on the compensation issue alone, and looked at all these concerns and all the requests, because we have requests from doing absolutely nothing to the contract to a whole another addendum that goes into exactly who's paying who, from the buyer paying either side of the brokers or the seller paying either side of the brokers, and discussed all the different concerns that were raised both by everybody sending comments and our own concerns to ultimately arrive as what I consider the first step, which may be the last step, but we took action that we could agree upon. And when some of the votes we had in that last meeting, or the meeting to go over this, were decided by one vote. We had some 6 to 7 votes on some of these issues. So it wasn't close. And we know it's not perfect. We know it doesn't satisfy everybody, but I think it definitely advances the ball forward, and ultimately may be the solution that sticks and that we stay with. But know that we're always looking at it. So if as we go through this, if you have any comments, send them in. We have our next meeting in January,
That's right.
and we're taking out kind of that bucket of things that we put aside to deal with the compensation issue. But we are going to constantly look at this and see if anything needs to be tweaked or changed and how it works in actual practice.
Yeah. And you said we had 11 hours of meetings, and that sounds about right. Plus, we had subcommittee meetings that met in between. And I mean, I spent hours reading the packet prior to coming down to Austin for the meeting because there were so many comments. And I was like, oh my gosh, let me just spend time. So I do think that, I mean, it's a volunteer gig, but the people that are on the committee are super passionate, whether they're contracts nerds or not. They're passionate about what we're doing, and they understand, I think, the gravity of the work that's being done. I mean, it's a big weighty thing to know that you're making these decisions as a group for all of these folks. I mean, Texas is a big state. There's a lot of people with access to these documents. So it's a big deal.
It really is a big responsibility. I think we have a very special makeup of the committee right now, and everybody truly cares. It's amazing to watch the passion come out. And these meetings are not your boring sit around the table meetings sometimes, right? the passion comes out, and it's a good thing. It's we want to get this right.
Yeah.
And so the change we made to paragraph 12 here. Let me pull that up on my screen.
That's fine. And if you want to, we can share the screen for folks to follow along, but I don't think we necessarily need to. But yeah, paragraph 12,
Yeah.
let's talk about it. So,
Yeah. So yeah, go
well, I
ahead
was
and
gonna
jump
say,
right in.
can I just say as a practitioner, paragraph 12A1B, even my lenders would be like, well, what'd you put in 12A1B? Like people just knew 12A1B was a thing, right? And even if you don't know, well, what paragraph is this other thing in? Nobody knows that's in paragraph 4, that's in paragraph 6. Nobody knows. But boy, they knew paragraph 12A1B by number, right? By number and letter and subsection.
Mhm.
And so for the longest time, 12A1B was always where we had a blank in there where we said seller will give money to the buyer. And the buyer can use that towards any of their closing costs, right? And it was just like willy-nilly, whatever you'd like, as long as it's one of their closing costs, which were listed right there adjacent to or near that paragraph. And then it was broke down, what are the buyer's closing costs? It was appraisal fees and credit reports and stuff, right? All of the things that they might have as buyers. But we moved that to 12A1C. And everybody was like, why
We
are you moving it? We're moving it to 12A1C for a good reason that maybe the real estate practitioners didn't understand. But I learned when we were in our meetings with the attorneys that if you're going to specify, you do the specific, the specific, the specific, this, and then at the bottom, you're like, and then everything else, like the general and anywhere else you want to use the money has to be at the bottom. I think that was a really great enlightening moment for somebody who's not an attorney to be like, now I understand why it's 12A1C, right?
the brokers put up a good fight on this one. So
We
for
did
everybody
because
out
we
there
didn't
that doesn't like
understand.
the order in changing it, it was this was a good battle between the I say the two sides. Acknowledging that it's I think definitely going to be an educational issue to get used to. Having it legally this way, where it's the A plus B and then everything else in C is C being the catch-all, makes a lot of legal sense in how it was drafted and how simple we could keep the terms.
Yeah.
We try not to add more words than we have to, and to make the catch-all in the middle would have been a lot more words, and generally not how legal documents flow. It's not an absolute legal doctrine that you have to do that, but it does make more sense on the legal side, even though we all might be used to it being 12A1B
Well,
as
I just
the catch-all.
appreciate this nugget of information as to why we made the change because I'm like a why girl. Like, okay, I see that you did it, but I need to understand the why so that it'll make sense to me and then I can move forward. So I like the why. So thank you for explaining in our meeting and helping the broker half of us understand the why. And maybe somebody listening today will be like, okay, now I see. But what did we do to paragraph 12A1B? Do you want to talk about it since you have it pulled up on your screen? What did we do there?
Sure. So we added what is a very short sentence, and it allows a specific seller contribution, as we typically know it, contribution towards a buyer's agent's fees. And it has some specific language in there, and I'll read it for the listeners today. It says and I'm paraphrasing the beginning of the paragraph, so the seller will pay, and it says the following amount to be applied to brokerage fees that buyer has agreed to pay. And I'm going to repeat that. The following amount to applied to brokerage fees that buyer has agreed to pay. And then there's a checkbox for whether a dollar amount or a percentage of the sales price. Now, there's some magic words in there. It's simple, but it has, buyer has agreed to pay, right? So we're having now an option for sellers to bring money out of their own pocket and pay directly over to the buyer for the specific purpose of their buyer's agent's fees. And there's specifically buyer's agent's fees that they've agreed to pay, not in theory, not just an amount because I want to take it as a buyer's agent, but an amount that the buyers actually agree to pay their agent. And so this now allows, if we step back to what you mentioned before, the old seller contribution, subparagraph B, was an amount to be applied to all these buyers' expenses, right? And we generally thought of it as almost any closing cost, any buyer expense closing cost. But it actually was a defined term. And the problem we have in 12A2 that defined what a buyer's expense is with this big old long list, right? A long laundry list of things. It did not include brokerage fees.
Yeah.
So that old paragraph couldn't be used to pay any as a seller contribution towards brokerage fees. So effectively what we did here is just allow a seller now to contribute an amount for that specific amount. And the big difference from the old MLS cooperative compensation is this is right out of the seller's pocket instead of coming out of the broker's pocket. Right? Cooperative compensation under the historical MLS agreements used to come out of the brokerage pocket over to the buyer side. Now, it may ultimately have come from the seller, but the difference here is this is straight out of seller to pay the buyer's agent's fees.
Yeah. I think it's important.
It's really that simple.
Yeah. And I think it's important. I like that you said that they've already agreed to pay, right? Because once upon a time, not that many moons ago, there were people who were realtors, right? Not just real estate agents, but realtors who were out helping buyers buy houses without an agreement with their buyer to represent them. And this agreement might specify what the seller had to, I mean, what the buyer needed to do, their obligations, what the agent needed to do, their obligations, and how much the agent might be being paid. There was no requirement that you had that, although everybody everywhere I ever talked to, my whole real estate career, almost 20 years, said it's a really good idea to get a buyer representation agreement because without it, you don't have an agreement that's enforceable, right? You just have this implied agency sort of relationship. But now there was a change in the rules for realtors, right? That the National Association of Realtors, the holder of the word realtor, right? That they said we have to now have some kind of a signed agreement of some sort. And it really, I don't think in the NAR stuff says it has to be a buyer rep agreement. It just says we have to have a written agreement of some sort. But I believe that most people took that in the spirit of it and said, I guess we'll get these buyer rep agreements signed. So now that's the agreement that you're talking about in the 1-4 family. And by the way, is it 12A1C? Because I'm not looking at it, or is it 12A2?
So 12A2 defines buyer's expenses and what's included in the laundry list.
Okay,
it is 12A1B, correct, that's the actual contribution section. So it's an amount 12A1B, the new 12A1B allows the seller to contribute to pay a buyer's agent's fees that the buyer has agreed to pay. And I think, semantics, this is where my wife's been a real estate broker for a long time. She's been in real estate 20 years. And she'd always kick me in the butt and say, stop being a lawyer. Stop over lawyering this deal. Stop talking so much. Talk to me like a normal person. In our warped lawyer minds, we get all technical and start using too many words, but basically having an agreement in place, to pay those fees. And one very important thing, which you touched on, is this rule for having an agreement in place is a National Association of Realtors rule. Right? This isn't a rule that binds all license holders.
Right.
And so when we're looking at the TREC contract, we're not directly doing this just because of an NAR rule. We're doing this because we, to take into account the actual practice, but I do think it's beneficial for the consumers at the end.
Yeah.
And kind of the thrust that NAR is doing here, and that I think we looked at as a committee is, well, what are the actual deal costs? What is somebody agreeing to pay? What's the value there? And that has agreed to pay, we're saying that the buyer has agreed to compensate this as a reasonable value at the end. And let me make a qualification. All the statements say not making on behalf of the committee. This is just our own personal opinions. Let me say committee, the broker lawyer committee.
Thank
This
you
is
for
not any
clarifying.
statement of the committee at all. So,
Give the
but
disclosure. This is
really,
just me and you talking. We're not committee at the moment. Yeah.
yeah. And so, real, but it gets the actual deal cost, and it's not inflating the amounts. These concerns raised in the lawsuits, whether you agreed it was an actual concern or not, was one of them was that it inflated the deal cost for everybody and made the cost of home ownership more expensive by having unnecessary fees go to brokers. And I think by and large that wasn't the case in many cases, but this is a way to make sure that the buyer has agreed to pay that amount. And any amount the sellers agreeing to contribute goes towards it, not to inflate it to go beyond what would be a reasonable compensation for the buyer. And buyer's agents are absolutely worth it, right? All the amounts you charge and more, you earn it so much. Now, there are cases out there where you have people just, buyer's agents do minimal work and frustrating listing agents out there. We all know those few that give the whole a bad name, but by and large, buyer's agents work so hard and earn every bit of their fees. So, but going back to the has agreed to pay, it's trying to take into account that kind of that broader concern that's been expressed on a national level and what's best for the consumer at the end by having that qualification.
Well, okay, there I have a couple of thoughts on it, right? Because I'm just going to clarify that for me, I always did buyer rep agreements. Ever since I first got into real estate, somebody just told me I needed one, so I just did one, and then I just did one every time, right? But not everybody practiced that, and there are, I guess, some people today that are not realtors that may still choose not to sign any kind of agreement in advance to make sure that they understand that the buyer has agreed to pay, right? I mean, that's still a true statement. That could still happen. But I believe in my heart of hearts, in the spirit of the whole thing, is that if I have this fiduciary responsibility to my client, right? And that is the law, right? Like we are supposed to be a fiduciary for our client. So if that's true, then one of the things I should do for my client is I should look out for their best interest. Well, how can I look out for their best interest if I'm going to look out for their best interest above everyone else, above even my own, or however people want to word that, is for them to truly understand what they're doing. You know what I mean? I think if you were buying a house, what's in your best interest is to understand the process and to understand the costs and to understand your obligations as the consumer and my obligations as your agent. I feel like all of that ought to be spelled out somewhere in writing because that's what's in the best interest of you as my client, right?
Uh,
So,
Absolutely. It's hard to think of entering into such a large transaction
yeah,
and without having an actual written contract that sets forth the boundaries of the scope of the representation, how I earn my commission, how I'm to help you. If we even start, the more basics, the IABS, right? The
yeah,
IABS form that's required to be provided is often just thrown in front of buyers and say, sign it real quick and not actually gone through to set the foundation. But take that one step further of, okay, that's just basic agency. Now let's talk about our exact agreement between us. What am I doing for you? What am I offering? What can you expect of me? And in return, what can I expect from you? And so it to me is very scary entering into any relationship without the confines set and the expectations set up front.
sure.
And
You
so I
want to
think it's a
know,
great rule and definitely in the best interest of both sides.
what I talk about sometimes is, okay, you have little kids, right? I don't know how old your kids are. Are they board game players? Do they play board games?
Yes, very intense board game players.
We are game players in my family, and I have kids, they're older now, but I also have grandkids now. And I have to say, when I play Candyland with the 5-year-old today, we might be skipping around on the board because, well, that means that I get to go over here. And they like to change the rules while we're playing the game. And I always just say, you got to know the rules before you play the game, right? Whatever board game you're playing, or whatever card game you're playing, it's pretty important to know the rules before you play the game. Otherwise, you might make a wrong turn somewhere and you might not end up in the Candyland castle, you end up in the molasses swamp or something. So if you know the rules before you play the game, then you're going to be better informed and be better able to make a good educated decision. And that is exactly what this whole let's get it in writing ahead of time thing feels like to me. Is if you set me down and said, Melissa, you're going to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on a house. Here are the rules before we play the game. I want the rules. You know?
Absolutely. I mean, it just makes it's common sense when you kind of boil it down to that. I think that's a great way of looking at it. And sometimes we get lost in the knowledge that we have, right? As practitioners, we've gone through the training, we've had many deals, we know the bounds of that. Where our clients, at the end of the day, this may be the only real estate transaction they do in their lives, and we I think lose sight of how little knowledge they have on what they can expect from us, what our duties are, what the whole process is. At the end, I always say, I phrase it as knowing the playing field. We know the playing field as agents, and we may not know how to run perfect plays, but we know at least the scope of it. They don't even know what playing field they're stepping on, whether it's a football field or tennis court or stepping into. They know it's real estate, but they don't know the whole process, and definitely not the duties from us. And so it definitely sets the expectation. It goes back to this payment issue as well, which you referenced, to be able to enforce an agreement to pay a commission between sellers or buyers and brokers. It has to be in writing, right? We can't go into court and say, pay me a commission on this at the end of the day unless we have that written agreement. Now, I'm going to qualify that. Between brokers, it doesn't have to be in writing. That's one of the scary things with these changes and all these new agreements. Broker to broker agreements can be oral. And so you have to be very careful on that front on making these new, now that we don't have MLS as establishing the relationship, but we'd be very careful on that side of having firm written agreements between brokers, or making sure our agreements are clear, because that is that little exception that we may dive into more later. But between your clients, and we're talking about here buyer agent agreements or buyer representation agreements, you need that piece of paper with the actual agreement to pay a commission to be able to collect it from your client.
Yeah. And if your client only agreed to pay, one amount, and what you wrote into the contract or what's in the paragraph 12A1B now, if it's a different amount, then I think that that's important to understand that it's to be applied towards what you've already agreed to pay. I mean, I guess somebody could amend what they've agreed to pay if the amounts were different, but they would need to make that amendment for sure, because that's what they're supposed to be applied to, is what they've agreed to pay.
Exactly. And there's nothing prohibiting that agreement from being amended here. And we had a lot of concerns raised over, well, they're just going to sign a quick amendment. Well, that's going to take a buyer/buyer's agent agreement, right? So it's not just, they're going to have to go and say, hey, I'm getting this higher commission over here, pay it to me. But that's going to at least spark a conversation of the buyer saying, well, wait a minute, why should I pay you more? Let's just take it off the sales price. It at least has that conversation, despite all these negative sides coming in, that is, well, they're just going to amend it. Well, they can, but at least there's some friction there to prevent that just from happening willy-nilly, if you will.
Yeah.
So I like that particular side of it, and it furthers the bigger issue. The other thing too, who's policing all this stuff, right? That's another big. Who is it going to be? Title? Is it do I have to show my buyer's rep agreement to prove up that I'm entitled to this amount? Is it the association that's going to do it? And the answer is, well, ultimately it's going to be the courts, and practically you almost never get there, right? There's nothing that forces anybody to show their agreement.
Yeah.
There's nothing that for the buyer's rep, that's one big concern here. Well, I'm policing this myself. You have to show it to me. Well, unfortunately, we don't have subpoena power outside the courts to be able to get that document. Lenders are requesting it right now, and a lot don't want to give it. And if that's an underwriting guideline, that's one thing, but they can't legally force us to give it to them. They can not give us the loan if we don't give it, but they can't otherwise legally enforce us to do it as a buyer agent or as a buyer. So I know that's going to be a frustrating thing with this on proving it up. A lot of providing firm provide invoices for the amounts, at least have something in writing. But this is where self-policing will come in. And if people are caught not telling the truth, that's going to be both a TREC issue and a Texas Association of Realtor issue at the end
For
of the
sure.
day.
Yeah. Well, and I've had builders ask for it. So lenders, builders, title companies, whoever. I think that the brokers just need to make sure that they're educating their agents on what their office policy is. Do we provide that document or not? And what do we provide if we don't provide that document? Do we provide something else? Like, is an email sufficient? Or like you said, maybe an invoice or whatever, something. So yeah, it's just a little, I think one of my instructor friends, he always says we have to understand the concept, right? And if you understand the concept, then it helps you to figure out the solution when a problem arises because you understand the concept. And so you can go, okay, well, if I'm working within this concept, here's an alternative, whatever, whether that's an email or something.
And I think the main concern that I hear raised is confidentiality. I don't want my business terms, and we have so many unique agreements being used now. It's not just the Texas Realtors Forum that is kind of the baseline that people use, because TREC doesn't have a buyer representation agreement. Right? TREC
Right.
does not promulgate one. A lot use Texas Realtors, but now in this new world we live in, a lot of brokers are doing their own,
Mhm.
and they're unique agreements that they don't necessarily want everybody seeing on the other side, whether it's their competitors or title companies, lenders, whoever it might be. And so they're more protective of that. And I see some of them that have information that the buyer probably doesn't want disclosed,
Yeah.
right? Of listing more buyer info in there, and even some that I've seen that actually have confidentiality clauses built in. That's not in the standard form, but a lot of these new unique forms have varying different degrees of that I've seen. So there's a lot of different things in the background that go into whether a particular broker and buyer want to provide that form to the other side.
Yeah. I agree with that. So, all right. So we chatted about 12A1B is now specific, but we do still have a place in the contract where the seller can give money towards the buyer's other expenses, right? And then it kind of goes to that list that's in 12A2, where it's all of the things that the buyer's going to be paying, like their loan origination fee and their, credit report fee and appraisal fee and whatever, right? So that still exists.
It still exists. It's just moved one letter down and has some language removed from it. So we did have it looks like a lot more red lines than are actually there, but no, the old 12A1B is now C. And just was slightly changed. I would say not much in substance, but you still have that catch-all that you can use generally like you did in the past.
Yeah. Okay. I love it. So people can feel comfortable that now they can specify some of the closing costs where they're going. This much is to the buyer's broker fees that they've agreed to pay. And then some of it is going towards the other expenses, whatever is in that laundry list of stuff. So we're feeling good about paragraph 12, but you mentioned at the beginning of our chat today that there were some other really kind of fun changes, some good things. When you first mentioned it, I was thinking backup addendum. I really loved the changes to the backup addendum. That may not be the one you were thinking, but that's the one I was thinking. I love the change to the backup addendum. What about you?
I do too. This was a long requested one. I give a lot of credit to Diane McCoy for really pushing this on the committee. She really, and when we were bogged down on other things, made sure this stayed on our radar and came up with a really good form. And effectively, what the new backup addendum does is allows for staged, earnest, and option money, where you don't have to put a big amount up front. You can do a smaller amount up front or whatever amount up front you want. And then when the contract goes in the first place, have a requirement where the buyer has to put up additional option money and additional earnest money. That operates essentially the same way as the original deadlines did and the process did. But now you can stage that. So you don't have to put that huge amount of earnest money and tie it up for a long time from day one until you actually go into first place. I think that's a great logistical change that we saw a lot of agents writing in legal language to try to accomplish that. Some might have been good, some might, not so good, but it was a practice of law, and they were trying to do what their clients were asking. But now we have some very clear language that allows that practice to take place.
Yeah, I agree. And I really like that it almost just, well, it really does just mirror the stuff that's in the 1 to 4 family contract where it talks about, and you've got 3 days, and we all have been trained that it's 3 calendar days, and unless it falls on a Friday, Saturday, or I'm sorry, Saturday, Sunday, or a legal holiday, and it has all of that stuff in there. I think that it just makes it really, really clear. So I think that's a fun form. And I like the fact that we put that together. And yeah, kudos to Diane. She always she sees a lot in the position that she's in. So she always tries to say, this is something we're seeing an issue with. Let's get it addressed, which I love.
Yeah, and this goes against a kind of our motto of keeping things as short as possible. But we just wanted to repeat some of the same language since we're bleeding over to the second page already, just to make it abundantly clear that effectively the same rules apply to the additional earnest money as the original earnest money, and additional option money and the original option money.
Yeah.
And so it does get a little wordy, but just know that simple concepts in there. You can put whatever amount up front, then more later on once you go in the first place.
Awesome. I love that. All right. So what other fun thing were you thinking? The other fun thing that I was thinking was third party and the fact that we closed that loophole, but you might have something else. We can talk about yours first.
I do. The T47, I think, is my favorite one.
I do love that too. I do.
That as my heart, I owned and managed a title company for years. I've didn't mention up front, I've had my agent's license, sales agent license. I'm a realtor as well. I owned and I'm an escrow officer license. I've closed a bunch of deals and ran a title company, and I know the frustrations with title. And I had to stick up for the title industry real quick. They do so much behind the scenes that I think not many people realize. They're kind of the punching bag in between a lot of sides, and it's a lot of grunt work, but there's a lot that goes into it. And I consider title a little bit of the Wild West. But this new change with the T47 was a common frustration. It satisfies the common frustration that was out there, and to a couple of different degrees. One is there's a new rule that Texas Department of Insurance came out with that allows a declaration as opposed to an affidavit to be used. Well, what the heck does that mean legally? Well, a declaration doesn't need to be notarized. A declaration has some magic language in there and some additional personal information that allows somebody to sign it and not have to go take down in front of a notary to be notarized. And I know that's a common frustration with listing agents out there, especially of getting their sellers to actually notarize it, or if you don't live near a notary, of trying to find one to get that up front. And it can have a big impact on the legalities and financials of the deal. So the new rule that came out from TDI says you can use this declaration. And so we added that to the contract, that you can use either the old T47 affidavit style, or you can use this new declaration. And so I think that'd make it logistically easier. I do want to caution everybody here that this change, you get, even though the new declaration's out there from the Texas Department of Insurance, when you hear that T name, T47, that means a TDI, or Texas Department of Insurance form. That's where we get that T from. The TDI has already published that declaration, so it's out there. Mm-hmm. But you cannot use it unless you're using the new contract, which is not yet available.
Right.
And even when the new contracts come out, if you have a deal on the old form, you can't use the new declaration, because their old TREC forms don't have that declaration language in there.
Yeah, they don't even mention the form exists. So yeah, if it doesn't say the form exists, you can't use it in that contract.
And it's the misunderstandings on that. You'll probably get that a lot. You'll see them practice. I get a lot of questions on that. But no, if you don't, historically, if you didn't provide the T47 with the actually notarized with the survey, then the buyer can then shift the expense of the survey over to the seller.
Yeah.
Regardless of if you're using 6C1, regardless of what box is checked at the end at the buyer or seller's expense, If that T47 affidavit and survey weren't timely delivered, then the seller is going to be responsible for paying for a new survey.
And
And that's
that's,
going to be the same if you don't timely deliver the declaration, but at least you don't have that notarization requirement. A lot
yeah,
of people before said, well, I'll just notarize it at closing. Well, it's not sufficient. It has to be notarized within that time frame.
yeah. And you know what else I love about it is I used to get a lot of people asking questions. Well, there's two sellers. What if only one of them gets it notarized and the other one doesn't sign it and all of this stuff? But I saw the wording on the revised documents from the Texas Department of Insurance, and they changed it to say, I am a seller, so that you can have like, you've signed one document and that's great. And then your spouse signs one and then that's great. And then maybe there's another third person, or maybe I had one time where there were six heirs and they all had to sign everything. And so having six of these and not having to get everybody in one room with one notary at one time, oh, so nice that you can, but you might actually end up with more than one document, right? Because you might have more than one seller on separate T47 or T47.1s, I suppose.
Yes, you can have multiple different forms, or you can use the same forms. So there's a place for two different signatures, I
Hmm.
believe, on the new forms. And another big change I was added to the actual T47 form itself was removing the blank for the date of the survey from within the language.
Yeah, they
One of
moved
the
it to the top.
common, yeah, they moved it to the top where it's great because before a lot of agents and sellers were filling in the date they bought the property,
Yeah,
which isn't sufficient. It has to go back to the date of the survey so the title knows no changes have been made since that time, not just during your ownership, but from before. And
yeah,
of course, sellers can look at the survey, look at their property, and say, these are the changes that have been made.
yeah,
Right? A lot of them say, well, how can I even make that change or state that? But you can look at the property and survey and make that declaration.
yeah.
So I think it's very good changes that were made there. The declaration does have some personal information added to it, where you have to provide your birth date in your address, actually in the form itself.
Yeah.
And so I know some might not want to provide their date of birth
They
in a
still
form like
have the
that. I
option.
think that's probably a small concern, but that's
Yeah,
why you have the option for both, I think.
yeah, you have the option. If you don't want to give your birthday, then go find a notary. They'll check your birthday on your photo ID. It'll be fine. Uh,
Yep, yep. Some are ultra sensitive out there on those. But I think that's practically going to be just again a great change. That just like the delivery of the option fee to the title company, I thought that was a great change
hmm.
made back then. That especially for rural agents,
Yeah.
having to not have to track a listing agent down somewhere or seller down in the middle of nowhere
Oh,
is
yeah.
the commonplace. So I think that's going to have a great impact on our day-to-day practice.
I think so too. I love it. Well, I know we're gearing up to be kind of out of time here. Is there any other document, something new coming that you just have to make sure we touch on today that you want to cover?
So in 2A, cover that real quick. I know you mentioned third-party financing addendum. We've now made a requirement for buyers that they want to get out and terminate the contract for buyer approval because they didn't personally get approved for the loan. They're going to have to provide not only the notice of termination, but written documentation from the lender setting forth the reasons why they were denied.
Yeah.
So effectively, it matches what we've already had a long time requirement for in property approval.
Hmm.
Right? So property approval, we made that change because people were saying it didn't appraise but not showing the appraisals. Well, we made the requirement to show some documentation there. We're mirroring that for buyer approval now. And just like with the property approval, there's no set form of what needs to be provided. It has to be written documentation from the lender, but we don't prescribe what type of documentation that is.
Yeah.
So it's open there. It's not a set thing that has to come in, whether it's an email or some form. But just know that you'll have to provide some written statement from the lender to get out under buyer approval within the time period.
Yeah. That was a good
Uh,
loophole to close up for sure.
and too many people were using it as an unlimited option, right? If I'm terminating because I didn't qualify, but then well, show me proof. Oh, I don't have to, and
Yeah.
maybe a lot of times they never even applied for the loan. They just were trying to get out. So I
Yeah.
think that's a great one. Know that the changes that we made to the end page 10 in the amount for the compensation or the
Underneath all the
disclosure of
signature
compensation.
lines and all the
Yeah,
stuff. It's not part of the contract, not enforceable.
not enforceable, and it's still not enforceable in there. So I think some are trying to rely upon that to enforce a broker to broker compensation agreement, and it's not. It's not enforceable. It has to be somewhere else. So
Yeah.
despite the changes that were made there, it's still not enforceable. And then the other one that I would highlight in the 1031 exchange addendum, it's a long requested form. I call that as the parties are agreeing to play nice in the sandbox.
Yeah.
You can't. This 1031 is effectively giving notice that you intend as a buyer or seller to do a 1031 exchange, and are agreeing to reasonably work together.
Yeah.
But it doesn't allow whatever parties do in the 1031 to delay closing or to shift any cost to the other side. It generally says you'll work together and sign any reasonable paperwork you need to help accomplish the 1031.
Yeah.
I think that was a great change. And last one I was going to mention, it's going back to the surveys. We've now, and the 1 to 4 in the other contracts that flow with it, made the getting a survey by buyer permissible under one of the sections. One long time request we had was we want a no survey box. And so we didn't quite go to a no survey box, but we did say that under the one particular checkbox that the buyer may get a survey
instead of shall.
Exactly.
Yeah.
One little word change, but at the same time, we said if you elect as a buyer not to get one, and this is a finance deal, that then you can't use that as an excuse to get out under the third party financing addendum if your lender later requires one.
Yeah.
And so you don't necessarily have to get one. We think it's in your best interest, or definitely I think it's generally your best interest, but you don't have to. But if you don't, you can't get out under the third party because of the survey.
Right. It's not one more extra out in the contract. Yeah.
Exactly.
I love it. Well, I feel like we've covered a lot of stuff. We've talked about kind of all of the big changes that are coming. We've talked about some other things that I think were just informative between like TREC and Texas Realtors and things like that. And I love that we had some of the why behind it too. I always think that that's important. So I just appreciate you coming and being on here with me today. Thank you so much for joining me. I really, really appreciate it. It was a good talk.
I enjoy being on here and with Melissa and the other instructors at Agent Advantage and a lot of good instructors out there take contract courses. There's teaching 3 hours of these new contract changes doesn't feel like enough. And then, we got kind of sidetracked on away from the contract issues at the beginning of this, but know that you can't study this enough and study it from those that really know about it. And really take advantage of the knowledgeable instructors that are out there, because there is a lot of minutia in these changes, a lot more we didn't go over today. So I would just highly recommend. In addition to those that have to just geek out on it, it's really important for your day-to-day practice to really understand and be on top of this before the new forms become mandatory, which would be January 3rd, I believe, is the mandatory date.
Yep, January 3rd is the date they're saying mandatory, and sometime between now and then, when they become available for voluntary use, start using them then if that's what your broker suggests. But everybody will be mandatorily on these on January 3rd of 2025. So yeah, good stuff. I love it.
I appreciate the opportunity to be here today, and definitely enjoyed it. I can talk contracts all day. So
me too. We could have been on here for like a 4-hour long podcast. It would have been great, but I don't think everybody wants to listen that long. Oh, I love it. Well, join us next time on the podcast. So we'd love it if you would like, follow, subscribe. And we always talk about ways for you to be a smarter real estate professional. So we'll see you here next time.